All right, let's just give it a minute or so as people trickle in here.
Mm.
All right, Suzanne. Well, I think we could probably get started with the webinar. Want to welcome everyone to the second of our webinar series. In this one, I think it's a particularly interesting topic that's very, very relevant to a lot of the conversations we have, and I know a lot of conversations are happening externally as well, which is how do you go and decide how to experiment with all of the new things that are coming out on the generative AI side of things? Which ones do you build in-house? Which ones do you buy? And then where do you make choices to partner? And I think there isn't a clear-cut answer. And I think as a preface, there isn't a clear-cut answer. It really depends on what type of organization you are, which use case you're turning to, what your resources and budget look like, what your long-term production needs are in terms of support. And I think I think that's exactly where we want to start the conversation today. And want to welcome Suzanne as well, who's going to be really the voice of the customer. Suzanne, do you want to maybe take a minute just to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hello, Suzanne. Just joined Ankur's team as Enterprise Success, and I will be helping welcome any sort of interested people who, from the minute they find out about us, all the way until they grow with us.
That's great, and hence the name, the Pie Grower.
Yes, yes. The pie and opportunity is infinite, particularly of that with custom Gen AI solutions.
Perfect. All right, well, Suzanne, what question should we start with in terms of the customer asking questions of this?
Oof. I'd like to start with the awareness of most of the people that I speak with, which is usually the CIO, CTO, CDO, now CAIO type, who used to have a firm grip around the build, buy, partner strategy, but realized that all the different goalposts have sort of moved within the last year. For example, around competitive advantage, priorities with IP, time to market, everything is sort of evolved into something else. So I think one of the things that we can do today is sort of explain what those shifts look like within that same framework. So if we just start off with building, for
Mhm.
example, when you talk about building an AI solution, what does that even mean? Does that mean calling in one of the models from, or the APIs from one of the foundational model builders? What does it even mean? Let's just start there.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think build has many components to it. The first big thing is what problem are you trying to solve for, right? So what business area, what use case do you think that Gen AI is applicable for?
Mhm.
And I think starting with that, I think is the first thing that a lot of companies go through, and people do struggle with that. It's companies struggle with that sort of where could it be applied. And so having that conversation up front strategically is very important. But the build, just to define that a bit more, is deciding to use basically the toolkit that's available on the broader market. So using the closed source models like an Anthropic model or an OpenAI model, or in some cases an open source model like Meta's Llama 2, and then taking that model as a starting point, that foundation model as a starting point, then to build a solution that you need. That means you're going to figure out all the rest of the components, vector databases, conventional databases, Kubernetes with GPUs, what cloud provider do you build on, where do you source GPUs if you need it, and which type of GPUs, writing all the code, of course, to go and make that magic happen. But that typically is the build. It's the most custom approach you could take internally, but you have to pick the tools and shovels yourself and then start one layer at a time. That's
Mhm.
the build component.
So if I were to simplify this for the COOs in my life, or the CFOs, that means a lot of new shovels, a lot. Like you would probably have to build a lot of new things.
A lot of things, a lot of new things. That's exactly right. And sometimes you may not have the personnel because, unless you have a very large and experienced ML engineering and most importantly, ML ops team, which I think a lot of companies just forget. Like they just think that they
Mhm.
could use talent they've had forever. So unless you have what I would say is like ML engineers and ML ops engineers that are familiar with generative AI and large language models, which are frankly fairly new, it does mean spending on net new hires first and foremost, and then spending on all of the other software stack that you need to go and start even attempting to build an application that can add business value.
Okay. So I think we're talking about the end goal of being able to do anything with AI or any of these AI partners. What if you haven't even wrapped your head around having a data strategy before you've started to think about your AI strategy? Can you have an AI strategy without a data strategy?
In some cases, you could. So, for example, I think the inclusion of ChatGPT into the workplace to get basically more knowledge to every single employee to go and query and ask questions of ChatGPT and get answers back. I think you don't need a full-fledged data strategy to necessarily do that. But outside of the simple like ChatGPT like use cases, you do need a data strategy. There's a lot of the work that we do is in regulated industries like banking, where we touch underwriting workflows. Unless you have really good data in order, you really can't start thinking through automating those workflows. I think that you do need a data strategy in order to have an effective Gen AI or AI strategy. Although I will say that the basically the barrier to entry has come down quite a lot. So it used to be 2, 3 years ago, you would need tons and tons of data. I'm talking about tens of thousands of data points to be able to then train a model to be effective. You need an order of magnitude less data to have an effective AI outcome. And so the burden on data is actually a lot less today, but you do need some data strategy in order to start having an AI strategy that you can put into motion.
Interesting. And with the data that you have, let's say that you embrace the ways of, last generation ML, and you got your data ducks in a row for this, and you have a lot of data. Is your data ready for these generative AI applications, or is there a process to prepare it for such?
There is definitely a process because you may have the data that needs to get converted, right? So a good example is if you have a lot of documents that you've cleanly prepared for underwriting workflow. You might have like pay stubs, tax returns, bank statements. It's great that you have all of that data accumulated to go and work with. But to work with a large language model, you'll need to convert that data into very clean OCR data, and then eventually you'll need very clean structured data to feed into a large language model to be able to go and make like decisioning possible. So you need to do a little bit more work above and beyond just having that data ready, although having that data ready is a prerequisite. The challenge that I'm seeing though is a lot of companies are not sure what they should be doing on top of their data to be able to make that data work with large language models. And that's mostly just a knowledge gap. It isn't that the knowledge isn't out there. It's just that unless you're really plugged into a really fast moving space, so Gen AI, unless you're really plugged into that, and have a lot of exposure, it may be very hard to go and figure out how to apply it. And so that's the gap that we're seeing right now. Some companies are closing that, right, by hiring great new talent to bring onto the team or bringing on vendors for POCs and pilots.
Okay, I understand. But what about sort of the time to value here? I understand that you can build applications a lot faster. I understand that there's no code solutions, there's co-pilots, there's AI as a service. Maybe you want to talk about a couple of those things. You can do these things faster, of course, to achieve your business goal. And usually the business goal is to make you more competitive or pursue a new area entirely. If you're going to build this internally to build a competitive moat, what does that look like today versus yesterday, considering how quickly somebody could copy you or evolve what you've done?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the time to ROI is super critical. Where we are today, a year after like Gen AI just became mainstream, is a lot of companies are stuck in POC land. Most of their work on AI or Gen AI specifically is in proof of concept, right? They kind of see some value. They've done some experiments, but they haven't gotten into production. Maybe because they haven't met some of the marks that they need in terms of the model not hallucinating, the model performing well more of the time than not. And they haven't figured out how to like integrate that into the rest of their business. And so things aren't moving into production. fast enough. And so it's not delivering any ROI. It's just a cost to the business today for the majority of businesses. Fortunately, I think what we've seen is that the ones that have gotten into production, like a ServiceNow, for example, is a really great enterprise example.
Yeah.
They see immense amounts of value creation in production. So another way to say it is that the light at the end of the tunnel is so large, the kind of the winnings at the end of the tunnel are so large that it's worth the pain in the POC land. But some companies will get disillusioned and will never make it to the promised land. Others will continue to fight the good fight and get there, and they'll see a lot of value there. But the more you could do to de-risk that journey, the better. So how do you get out of POC land? How do you get ROI faster? Part of that is picking the right use cases, right? So
Mm-hmm.
picking the right use cases that are ripe for Gen AI, given who you are as a business or organizationally, how much talent do you have, how many resources do you have, can you bring on external players, either hiring external talent or bring on external vendors to go solve that use case. These are all things you need to ask and answer appropriately. But then once you found a use case, your choices then come down to, do you use no code? If it's a simple problem, no code may make sense. Right. So if you have
Mm-hmm.
email automation, you want to generate copy for email sequences to do outbound, great. There's probably a no-code solution. In fact, a lot of companies provide that generation capability. If you have something that's a little bit more complex, like prior authorization handling in healthcare, you likely can't use no code. You do need developers. And then your decision is, do you use internal developers or external developers to work on the problem? And how do you figure out which segment of prior auth handling that you tackle first, right? So break it up into a smaller task, solve for that smaller task, get ROI on that smaller task, hopefully like reduce the personnel expense that you incur there, and then move on to the next tranche. So you're getting things into production while you're shipping, and so you're not doing this massive build that takes 18 months. You're like shipping faster, right? It's like the whole Facebook model, which is ship things very, very quickly so you see value much faster.
Yes. So from what I'm hearing and then distilling it is there isn't necessarily a competitive moat in building, but if you're able to adopt these tools and use these tools that are a little bit more flexible and efficient, you can, I guess, hedge against falling behind the competition. So right now, if you're not using these tools and getting them into production, at least at the most high value use cases, whether you build, whether you buy or partner, you're at a disadvantage already because
That's
that's where your
correct.
competition is.
Yep.
However, if you're going to be doing these POCs and going to be spending all this time and resources, you should be doing other things to move the ball forward.
That's correct. I mean, I think we're still early on in the journey. So, for those that haven't incorporated Gen AI in production just quite yet, I would say you're a little behind. You're not like completely behind because most companies are in that camp. But over time, there is going to be a big chasm between the ones that have gotten into production versus those that haven't. Right. That's the challenge that I see right now.
Oh, I have a popular question. So a lot of people did not automate a lot of processes that are considered boring, rote, repetitive, the back office, like, headaches,
Yeah.
because they just didn't think it was possible with RPA. And they were right. It was not possible with RPA. So they're in a position now where they're looking at their human workforce and they're trying to augment them effectively. And they have no idea that Gen AI can even be used for automation. I even saw a post the other day from my friend who is quite the mover and shaker in this space and wasn't aware that Gen AI was able to do this. What do you say to those people who, haven't even thought about Gen AI for automation, particularly with those types of processes?
Yeah, yeah. So I think a couple things. One, it's surprising to me that a lot of people still view Gen AI as ChatGPT, right? It's
Yeah.
like synonymous, and so people think of like asking a question and getting an
Yeah.
answer in some sort of chatbot type manner, and that is a very popular application of Gen AI. That's one of many, many applications. So let's talk about automation, right? So a lot of people are focused on getting information read from documents. These could be like in underwriting is a great example for insurance or banking, where you're pulling information out of these documents. Gen AI is so capable of doing that. Essentially, what happens is you pass in OCR data into a large language model. So that's the input. Think of that as being the thing that you put into the prompt. And then the output is a structured JSON. So it's exactly the key value pairs that you need in order to go and populate the next step of your underwriting process or some data entry function that you're doing. Now, it's
Mhm.
not as simple and reductive and trivial as that, but in a nutshell, it is basically that. It's an input, which is OCR data, output is the JSON. That is a Gen AI application that you could do over and over again that would automate or augment a lot of the people-heavy operations that you have. Those are
Mm.
the types of problems that we work on, and more companies should be aware of that. That's one type. Which is getting data out of documents. The other one is querying data that might be in a less accessible format, right? So RAG obviously is very popular, and getting RAG to perform very well in mission critical use cases. That's hard because it hallucinates often. But you can do RAG because large language models can bring the right context from those documents into the model. So when you ask a question, it takes that appropriate context and gives you the correct answer. So querying, information retrieval, super, super critical. The best example of this that obviously a lot of people are familiar with or have started to hear about is glean.com for enterprise search,
Oh
right?
yeah.
And then another one is data that's in a database. Like people don't realize that you could ask a large language model a question, it could query that database using code and then give you the right answer back. So querying, information retrieval, these are very, very common things that most knowledge workers do. All of these can be augmented or automated away using Gen AI, right? So there's many, many applications like this that are low-hanging fruit for most organizations. That's why I think a lot of people are describing Gen AI as as big or bigger than the advent of the internet. So, I mean, some people are describing it as like as big as the Industrial Revolution. I think that might be a little bit far-fetched, but we'll see. But it's certainly not. This is not like a AR, VR, even a Web3 type of impact. It's much, much larger than that, just given where we've seen progress today.
Oh yeah. One of my favorite ideas is that the internet was just created to be a training data set for large language models. Like, I mean, I was like, okay, cool. It's just AI food. All that we've been doing is creating data for this thing to eat and make our lives easier. It's an
Yeah,
idea.
I mean that's a very incredible kind of point. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Everything we've done over the
Yeah.
last 20 plus years is
Yeah.
is to bring us where we are today.
Yeah. I'm a little meta and TED talky, so I'm trying to bring it down to the people today with the conversation. So we're talking about building, we're talking about buying. I think one of the things that's evolved a lot is that it's become a lot more approachable and reasonable and strategic to just buy some of these early stage startups that are AI companies, right? It's, I'd say, relatively cheaper from a headcount standpoint. It's faster and easier for a company to say spin something up and be a viable or very useful
Mhm.
feature within somebody's solution that might become core IP. Talk to me a little bit about that, like how before there was a the build buy partner was mostly about just buying software, but now it might actually be more advantageous considering the cost of building these generative AI solutions to just buy a startup.
Yes, I think for very large enterprises, that's an option is to go and acquire a company that is doing this and bring that entire DNA and the stack
Hmm.
together. I think for most companies, the buy is going to be mostly buying software that another company has and
Yeah.
then building on top of it. And that could certainly work for some of the use cases, ones that are maybe less complex. That works well because you could go bring something external, like a Glean.com is a great example. You could buy that software, incorporate that. That gives you enterprise search capabilities. And
Hmm.
enterprise search is, I would say, maybe it's more standard where you don't need a whole lot of customization. So buying Glean.com and then customizing yourself may make sense, right? And I think there is that opportunity. It's just you're not going to build a Glean.com. So why would you build your own information retrieval for enterprise search capability within your org? Why would you build it from scratch when you could buy it, right? So that's kind of the idea. There are going to be many applications where it makes more sense to buy software. Um, and for some companies, they may mean acquiring the company outright. And that's probably going to be a rare phenomenon unless you're enterprise. But that's certainly very much an option as well for some of these companies.
Interesting. Interesting. And what about companies that are worried about maintaining their own IP? Let's say you're a mid-market insurance company, you're either working with a SaaS provider, an AI powered SaaS provider, or a custom solution provider, or you outsource development and you're worried about maintaining your own IP. What would you say to somebody in that position if that is, delaying their ability to buy or partner?
Yeah, I think so. There are a couple things about the IP. Obviously, having data leave your walls is always a really sensitive problem, particularly in regulated industries like healthcare and banking and insurance, like ones we touch. It's not always the case for every industry, but the data privacy and security is a really critical component. The other bit is you don't want to take your data, which is very valuable, and then have that become training data for someone else to use to improve their models. So that these are really important considerations to work through. And I think fortunately, a lot of AI startups aren't using the data, or at least they say they're not. We take a much more aggressive stance, and this is kind of, I think, a stance I think more companies will start taking, which is we build on our client's cloud or on-prem, so no data leaves our walls. And what I mean is that no data leaves our walls to even hit a closed source model like an OpenAI or Anthropic, because we're using open source models that are fine-tuned on the client's data, so no data leaves. It's not their, obviously they're paying a subscription fee to us for access to what we've built for them,
Yeah.
but their data is not going to be sent to a competitor. It's not going to make the broader market better, right? So they're not worried about that as a competitive threat. The IP though is how do you use this technology to improve your core product? That's still their IP. That's still their business, right? You're just finding enablers that are invisible. It's like middleware software that enables them to get their outcome done faster, better than they could have ever done before.
Mm.
So I think the IP question is important. I think for some companies it is a blocker in the sense that they will want to build everything from in-house. But I think the question is that unless you have really strong DNA on ML or ML ops or Gen AI, it probably does not make sense for you to build everything in-house. So
Yeah.
obviously a Meta or Alphabet will build everything in-house because that's what they are. That's the business that they're in. But if you're a Prudential or one of these companies, Pfizer or Citigroup, you could build some in-house, but it's also likely that when you're outside of your wheelhouse in terms of ML capabilities, you do want to get external vendors in the mix, right? And one way to handle this, by the way, I think is really valuable, is to do a lot of experiments, is to do a lot of POCs, pilots with external vendors. They bring a lot of learnings to the table, and then you could incorporate that into your strategy. So then it makes you more informed as to what do you actually build in-house versus what do you buy from software vendors.
Exactly. Oh, okay. I have a kind of a hybrid question going from that. What do you say to, mid-market enterprise companies that are getting tons of love from like the Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and all the other hyperscalers? Not only are they getting a lot of love and resources from them from their core business, but also throughout their ecosystem. So they're
Yeah.
getting all the benefits of a buy and partner from one place while they build. So it's kind of like all three in one. How do you recommend them layering in experimentation and buying, the services of startups? And why would you?
Yeah, so great question. So I think for enterprise, they're definitely doing a lot building in-house and doing POCs like
Mhm.
internally even. They do turn to partners of AWS or GCP and Azure, and the way it works is that Azure or GCP or AWS pays the partner because they're betting on the value of the long-term relationship, and
Yep.
so the enterprise is getting a free basically POC from a partner, right? And if that's like more of a consulting play, which is good for learnings. But the challenge always is like once that's built, and it works, and that's a big if. As I said, a lot of companies are getting stuck in this, which is they're doing extended POCs and never getting to production. But
Yeah.
once that actually lands in production, who's going to own that, right? Is it going to be the internal engineering team? Are they going to hire that partner long term? What does the cost of that look like in terms of support, whether it's internal or external? So these are really important questions. I think the other alternative to all of this, of course, is going to a software vendor where they are basically you're buying software with from them, or you're partnering with them long term on some software need that you have on the Gen AI side. They're getting it to you, maybe with customization, maybe with not. We take the very heavy-handed customization approach because we believe that's the best way to deliver automation. In fact, we think that's the only way to deliver high levels of automation. But then what happens is that we or another software vendor stick around for the long haul, right?
Mhm.
So we are, obviously you're paying a recurring subscription, but with that, you're getting things like explainability, observability, interpretability, like all of this dashboarding capability to go and see the value that's being created. We're also intervening when they're failures, like when you don't have the uptime, or when there are anomalous latency, things like that happen that hinder your service. Like we're coming in and intervening. And so we're taking that cost and pressure to continue maintaining good software off of you. But these are the important things that enterprise should look at, because sometimes the free is free up front, but then it becomes very expensive and difficult in the long haul. So I think having a mixture of build in-house, go with partners of AWS, and then go with software vendors, and then see which one actually has the best results on a time frame that makes sense. That's the experimentation that I would be going through if I were on the enterprise side.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Yeah, I talked to a lot of companies who are doing these POCs, through these partnerships and through their ecosystems, and they start to tell me what they're building. Sometimes there's dozens, even hundreds. And a lot of the things, I can think of 10 startups who have that ready in production that they could get started probably within 3 months. And meanwhile, they're expecting to play around with it and test it and also take on all of the risk. But yeah, it's almost like free things get you stuck, right? Because you just don't have the proper skin in the game, and you can't really make those sort of painful trade-offs like cost, time, etc. And it also makes you not look towards other vendors. Makes you not look around.
Yeah.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
other
it's fine. That's exactly, I think, where a lot of companies are stuck, is that they are getting bombarded with a whole lot of free, and it makes decision making difficult for them because they choose a couple of free players, and then they're doing POCs that are taking up a lot of time and attention, and they're not getting into production. Whereas, in fact, like paying a vendor, sometimes it might be the right decision because you have more skin in the game. There's a level of urgency. You actually do much more due diligence. That's the interesting thing. And then if you're not getting ROI and you're incurring that POC cost or that pilot cost, you're more likely to say, hey, this is not working out. I paid something. I should be getting something in return. So you're able to kind of make decisions faster, right? You fail fast sometimes, and that's sometimes that's the right outcome. It's like you fail fast, you learn a lot. That
Yeah.
frees you up attention and time wise to go and do something more beyond that.
Yeah, and I think from what I hear, the reason why people don't do that is A, startups are perceived as more risky, and B, they don't want to go through the butt pain of procurement. All of these major players that we've mentioned have been in their systems for decades. So it's very easy for them to come in, give them things for free, and help them explore sometimes hundreds of different use cases for an undefined period of time. But when it comes to the procurement side of things, how do you recommend having those conversations with your champions so that they can make it clear why, hey, I understand that we're doing all this stuff over here with this established vendor, but this is the urgency in actually proving this out and deciding whether or not this one day thing that from POC could go to production is the best trade-off from a cost perspective.
Yeah, so I think for us, we do a lot of consultative sales, and the reason why we do it is because, obviously we've been doing this for a long time. At least I personally have been doing this for a very long time, and so one of the things that I try to do is inform the buyer around what use case should you tackle, when could you expect the ROI, is the potential ROI worth the investment, and that for automation it comes down to how many people are doing this workflow that if automated could unlock a lot of value. And typically, if that value creation isn't mid six figures, sometimes seven figures, it may not be right for automation because there's a lot of investment up front that you'll need to make to automate it. And we want to make sure the ROI is 5x or 10x or more. So choosing which use case you work on among the many use cases that you likely have, very, very critical. And the organization might only be able to pay attention to a set amount of use cases at a given point in time. Once you have the use cases, then the choice is based on your budget and how your organization is set up in terms of talent and engineering resources available. You then choose to decide like whether you build in-house or whether you go into pilots and POCs with consulting firms or software vendors. And obviously with a software vendor, you probably will get less customization to some extent, whereas with consulting firms, you'll get a lot of customization. The software vendor, though, is going to stick around for the long haul, providing that software to you. Whereas the consulting firm typically isn't going to stick around. So the cost of ownership in terms of your talent having to be involved long term to make it work for you could be high. So that's kind of the trade-off that we help companies think through. Ultimately, where they get to is they get to visualize a future or end state that helps them calculate the potential ROI. And what does that look like in terms of ownership cost, like in terms of owning this in production, right? How much are they paying and how much value are they getting? Once that's painted, then it becomes easier to go have the client or the prospect make a decision. Is the investment is the ROI that you'll get worth the investment that they're making? And then also given the time frame that ROI is going to be realized. So if you don't have the pain tolerance for 18 months of R&D to get ROI, let's not do an 18-month project. Let's not do a use case that requires 18 months of setup. Let's do one that requires 3 months of setup. So you see a win, and then let that win be the thing that helps you go and have more organizational buy-in into the next more complex workflow or use case to adopt Gen AI and then work through that, right? And sometimes the answer is not, like multimodal may not be the right fit. Like we only do complex workflows. So if something's simple like email automation, we just won't touch it because there are better vendors that are simpler, they cost less, that can plug and play, and you're ready to go. But anything that is very complex, that's very regulated, that is mission critical, that the cost of failure is very high, those are the ones we like. And so we kind of navigate, at least the conversations we have, towards that direction, and then we help inform like who you should turn to for the rest.
Interesting. This is a conversation I have with a lot of leaders in the field. They want to work with these safer, larger, more established platforms, right? Like they're on Gartner's Magic Quadrant. Their board's not going to get mad at them. Their peers aren't going to get mad at them. It feels low risk. However, if they need a certain level of customization or they have a level of urgency, it goes on a roadmap. I used to manage these roadmaps. Or I was on a roadmap as an enterprise client. So I understand that. And one of the things that I've been trying to explain to leaders is that if you're a lighthouse customer and you're really, really willing to give it a go with them and try something that not only is going to be valuable to you, but could be really valuable to that startup, you might get a level of customization and enthusiasm to make your dream come true that you would never get from the bigger players, which would not only be safer because you'd have a lot more skin in the game, but also a lot faster and probably cheaper.
That's right. I think that's exactly right. I think some of the best, fastest moving work is being done by startups because they have that hunger, right? For them, it's essential to the business growth. So they basically put more skin in the game. They work harder. They bring more talent to bear. They have more know-how from doing it. Typically, it's not always the case, but typically, right? And so you're getting much more output per dollar than you would with some of the bigger enterprise. Of course, the bigger enterprise sometimes is easier to bring in, right? So you don't get fired for bringing BCG in the door or McKinsey in the door. So there are a lot of decisions above and beyond the amount of value you get per dollar in that purchasing decision, and you just have to be aware of that in the market. But I think this is where it's really hard to figure out what to build in-house, what to buy from external vendors, and then which vendors do you partner with long term, right? And I think it really depends on what workflow you're trying to, or task or use case you want to work on, and then whether the organizational DNA and the personnel is staffed appropriately to go and build in-house. And if that's not the case, then your choices kind of narrow down to buying, and then partnering. And I think then you kind of narrow in on what do you try to buy, and then kind of bring in and try to potentially do a little bit of light build on top, or try to find long-term partners. And I do think that is the fastest way to bring DNA that you don't have on Gen AI into the door, right? Because these other external players have that DNA, they have that know-how. Quickest arbitrage you can make is go and bring that talent in, even if it costs you something to do POC pilots, learn a lot, and then start experimenting faster than you would otherwise, and then pick and choose which ones you want to work with long term, and then let that be your foray into Gen AI, because you don't want to miss this as well, right? I think a lot of companies miss the internet, and they don't exist. We don't hear about them, but they did miss it. And I think similar things could happen on the Gen AI side. I think if you miss this big inflection point, you may not be able to recover in due time. I think we're still in the early days, so it's not too late. But a year or two from now, I think it may be too late to get on the bandwagon and remain competitive, because others will just be so far ahead of you in terms of the pack.
Absolutely. And sometimes adoption varies between industries. Like if you're in financial services and you're not running towards this, like you are left behind because adoption in financial services is so vast and it's like machine learning is just part of their DNA already. Whereas if you go to manufacturing, especially on the food side, they'll tell you, oh, this is an antiquated business. We don't move so
Mhm.
fast. We know this and that. And I'm like, okay, like I understand. That was very similar to how retail felt in the boom of e-commerce. And there were some pretty serious gaffes with core business, not some extra optimization opportunity, not something that would maybe touch the bottom line and improve their margins. I'm talking like Target powering its e-commerce offering through Amazon for a
Mhm.
long time and then having to like move that back in house after doing it all that time.
That's right.
They couldn't be more core, right? It's how they sell their products.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think the ones that experimented early on made a made a bigger pivot point. And then the ones that didn't make the transition, like some of the like
Yeah.
Barnes and Noble is a great example, right? They are no longer in business, and they're no longer in business because they just never got their internet strategy in order. And it took them a while to like die a slow death, but they did. And then you have a company like Walmart. Obviously, Walmart has many things going for it, but it was able to eventually start figuring out some of its strategy. And now, like Walmart's trying to do, last mile of delivery. They have, subscription programs, like their own version of Amazon Prime, right? So, they were able to navigate. I think similar things like you could be a very large enterprise, very successful, have a really great business model, but then if you don't adopt this fast enough, you become less competitive. And I think in financial services, fortunately, I think what we're seeing is a lot of companies, enterprise especially, this is less true of mid market, but enterprise is doing a lot of pilots and POCs. So I
Yeah.
do think that many of them will figure it out, but some will figure out better than others, right? A great example is JP Morgan. They've like just killed it, crushed it in terms of growth over the last 10, 15 years. Whereas many companies that were in the same category or similar category, it just didn't expand quite as much. And it's because they made some really smart acquisitions, which again, for JP Morgan, they have the resources and capital to build in-house, but some of their incredible innovation has come from really timely acquisitions that they incorporated really well, right? So even for large enterprise, you have all the resources in the world, all the ML talent that you could possibly want to hire, but you still may want to go and bring fresh DNA into the mix. And so that's kind of the decision point that a lot of companies will face with Gen AI this time around. I think mid market, and then what I would say is like manufacturing, some of the hospitality industries, they're the ones that are less targeted. So I do worry about like them getting attention and love from Gen AI companies, both consulting firms and startups, but they need a lot of attention because they have many problems that Gen AI is really capable of solving. It's just like who's going to go in the door and like get them the service and support that they need. For some like BCG, they won't even touch mid market because their price points are too high. Creates an
Right.
opening in the market for players like Multimodal and other software vendors to kind of fill that void. So I think that'll be a really interesting area to see in the long haul as well.
Mhm. Just so all of our listeners get a sense of mid-market, what do you mean by mid-market versus enterprise? Like clearly, okay, let's JP Morgan is clearly enterprise, the big companies.
Yeah.
Okay, what is mid-market? How would you like from a revenue standpoint, from a headcount standpoint?
Yeah, so I think mid-market could be a very large category, but typically the way we look at it is like it's $50 million in ARR or more. Sometimes it could be less, but that's a really good juncture. All the way up to about 500 million in ARR, sometimes
Mm,
more, right?
yeah.
So it's and the reason why we say that is it's a large gamut there's a lot of companies that aren't the largest companies out there, but they have a lot of needs. And they're not worth, in some cases they're not worth north of 10 billion, but they're still very sizable businesses that have been around for a very long time, clearly
Mhm.
working, maybe not scaling quite as in the same way as some of the biggest enterprise, but they're the ones that are maybe less targeted, right? Those are the ones that I think are what we classify as mid-market most broadly.
Interesting. So the non-three comma club folks that have a lot of capital, have a lot of people, have a lot of processes that need to be optimized,
Right.
but yes, but aren't going to be buying $100 million startups anytime soon.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
Might be able to buy a $2 million one though. We'll see.
Yeah.
Probably it's going to start happening because the cost of building, from what you're saying, could be $2 million to build out the foundation for a real Gen AI strategy. And if they don't
It could
already
be, but you could de-risk it, right? I think we've
have.
seen companies that have started to invest, um, north of 100,000, but not more than 1 million, so somewhere in the six-figure range, and they've seen outcomes that are 5, 10x that. We've seen that like through our first year in existence. We worked with companies there, so and that's mostly in mid market. So you can make a really prudent investment, the cost of a few engineers at most, and get a payoff that's many more times that. So and that's the type of experimentation that I think we will start seeing more of as we go.
What about exposure and upskilling for your mid-market development teams? By working with a variety of startups, by doing a lot of POCs, do you think this up levels their ability and their knowledge of the space? Because like to your point, like everyone's banging down the enterprise's door. They're
Yep.
getting so much push. They are getting so much attention. They're getting so much free stuff. Mid-market, not so much, like a lot of unknown names, I guess to the software community, the young software community. So in conversations that I've had, with mid-market and people in, I guess, like untouched functions, you know, it also means that their tech teams aren't getting that type of exposure to help the business user, the business owners, and the business owners also aren't getting the exposure to then push down to their tech team and say, help me do this with this. I now know what's possible. So how would you recommend approaching this? If you were to, what would be the ideal situation to go into a mid-market company? Like give an example of a vertical, give an example of a conversation to sort of bring those teams together to create the type of awareness of like what's even possible.
Yeah, so mid-market, they're not very seasoned buyers for the most part because
Mhm.
they're not getting the attention and the love that enterprise has been getting forever. So for them, it's like a little bit more of a learning curve in how to even make a purchase decision. So all the things we're talking about here, buy, build, partner, they're having to kind of work through that from scratch. And for them, it could be it's a little bit of a steep learning curve. But the way we've been approaching it, and the way we think that more companies should, is these companies have a lot of personnel expense that you can go in and make more efficient, change to like the future of work. Um, but and I'll give you an example, like credit unions or claims processing companies for insurance. A lot of these are mid-market companies that do work for the largest carriers in the world, right? And they're doing something that is very painstakingly manual and involved. Some of it's querying information, some of it's working with paper documents or PDFs, right? For claims processing, it is that you get a bunch of documents to basically corroborate like the validity of an incident, and then if it's a legitimate claim that's filed, then the processing company files that claim and then pays out on behalf of the carrier, right? That is very manual, a lot of BPO functions, a lot of mid-office functions. It's You could automate that away. So the approach is showing basically how the technology can sit alongside the people. So it's augmenting the people operations, and eventually it might augment or automate large swaths of it, but starting in one area and then eventually moving to broader capacity. But it's showing them that this technology is not scary. It's there's a way to like frame it where it's more digestible, and then it's about de-risking it by having a small scale POC or pilot or trial that you bring to the client so they can see the value that's being created. And once they see that, then it kind of helps them, regardless of whether they understand the technology fully or not. I think that's besides the point. It's that they're seeing outcomes are really positive that's impacting or could potentially impact their business, and then they're able to invest more into it. And we've seen that as a winning strategy for mid-market. It does take a lot more education upfront, though.
No, I understand. But I think it's worth it because they need it just as much, and they
Mhm.
don't have as much, I'd say, competing forces already in there constantly. You can come in, do a couple of POCs, really focus, get the results, and then advance with trusted partners.
Mhm.
But I want to talk about the fear factor here, especially around hallucinations, the unpredictability of the model. From what I'm hearing, it seems that there's more trust in building it in-house, even though they have often no experience with AI governance or AI safety or even this new era of compliance that they're having to
Mhm.
adhere to. So, what do you think that's about? And like, why would maybe a vendor whose entire business is AI
Yeah.
be a little bit better equipped to do that?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question because this is where a lot of particularly regulated industries get stuck is that they get a POC, it kind of works on paper, and then when they release it in production, they don't realize the amount of work that's involved post deployment, like in production, that's required. So having the AI model function really well the majority of the time, and then be able to when it can't have confidence, doesn't have confidence, to be able to say it doesn't have confidence as opposed to hallucinate and try to predict something and then be
Mm,
wrong, right? Because the cost of
mm,
failure is so high. So knowing like when to hand off to a human versus not, that's really important. Production capability. Knowing how to help like a non-technical user or technical user understand how the model came to a particular decision or outcome, that's super critical, right? So the explainability, the ability to interpret results, given how large language models are largely black boxes, that's really, really important. And then
mm,
being able to track like just usage data, and uptime and latency, and when something breaks, getting alerts. Like there's a whole level of complexity around that that you don't even anticipate if you're an ML engineer building it like in an R&D environment. But unless you do all that post-production support really well, then unless you do it well, it's not ready for use in production,
mm,
and that's where a lot of things will eventually fail as well. I think the
mm,
reason why some startups, I mean, startups in general are probably better equipped is because they're doing this for all of their customers. So they're not having to reinvent the wheel every single time. They're introducing it as a part of their feature set for all of the work that they do for every single customer that they have. And so the cost of building that right falls dramatically on a per customer basis because they're able to amortize that cost over large clientele. Whereas if you build it in house, you're almost having to rebuild. It's like reinventing the wheel when someone already has a wheel, right? If someone already has a wheel, you might as well work on the next piece that's important versus having to kind of craft a wheel yourself. And I think too many companies are trying to solve this from a low level perspective, even though their DNA is not ML, right? I think that's kind
yeah.
of my big advice is like be careful about what you decide to build in house. Some things do make sense to build in house, but you're not going to build a glean.com for enterprise search. You're not going to build a GitHub Copilot for code generation. If your use case is very specific and some vendor has built something very good for that specific use case, like go use that vendor and then go work on this basically a subset of problems that are very core to your business that no one else has touched, that you have to build in house because no one's going to close the gap otherwise.
Oh, totally. Plus, especially startups and vendors have gone through the ringer having to prove that they're safe and compliant enough to work for any company they're going to
Hmm.
work for. Even if a company doesn't have those checks and balances internally, they put their vendors through the ringer just to make sure that
Yes,
they don't bring
correct.
anything unnecessarily, like a terrible Trojan horse or something. A very smart data scientist told me that if you build in house, you're under a lot more scrutiny. You're going to be under scrutiny like an AI company. But if you call an API or you use the API of another, you just have to rely on explainability. So, and that scrutiny will come from anytime you automate something that uh, delivers something or impacts the life of somebody, like, whether or not they get health insurance or
Hmm.
how well their case gets underwritten, etc.
Yeah, I think that's mostly right. Although I think there's a lot of unanswered questions. So, for example, if an external vendor gets something wrong, like you partner or you buy from an external vendor and they get something wrong, let's say for an underwriting decision, who faces the liability, right? Does the liability sit with the underwriting function within a bank, or does it sit with the vendor? And how do you have proper insurance policies in place, both the vendor and then the bank, to make sure that I mean, if an incident occurs, and it will at some point, like who faces that liability? So I think that liability sharing is critical. I will
Yeah.
say that if you build something in house, and you rely on a small team that's built it. I mean, we know this. Engineers, they move from shop to shop every now and then, right? So how do you go and transition what was built, which could be really mission critical to the org, and transition that to other stakeholders, other people
Mhm.
that need to go and maintain and evolve it? In some ways, the more true and tested solution for you is to have a partner that is a longtime partner that will see that transition, despite personnel changes you might have internally in your org. And that might be a better result than relying on a few set of engineers that could, that built in-house that, 4 or 5 years from now won't likely be at the company, right? So I think
Yeah.
deciding well, like there, I think is super critical. And then all the governance things you're mentioning, right? Who bears the liability? Can you understand the decision? How is the decision made? How do you develop trust in the AI? I think these are pretty critical.
Yeah. Especially with the rate these engineers and teams are getting laid off and shuffled around.
Mhm.
I imagine morale is a little a little iffy. So, might be good to give them a little bit of support and encouragement from some external partners versus, putting it all on them after you disrupt their worlds a bit. Okay,
Mhm.
so Peter Hung has a question. Thank you, Peter. How should enterprises choose between the different LLMs, or should enterprises leave this software to vendors? Also, how do you think about the efficacy of small language models? Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. So I think enterprises may have an informed view on the LLMs that make most sense for them, or maybe another way to phrase this, make the most sense for them from a security perspective, often more than anything else. And so, for example, we know enterprises that are, basically they only want to use Azure OpenAI because they don't trust OpenAI directly, or they're not sure about Anthropic's
Okay.
stance on some of this, right? And so, I think that enterprise, when equipped to make that decision, should certainly inform and maybe make the decision for the vendor themselves. I think a lot
Hmm.
of vendors are a little bit more open and flexible because they realize that enterprises also have really great context and knowledge, and they could also help inform that decision. We certainly come up with our own recommendations, but we can let our companies that we work with choose. And sometimes we push back, and sometimes we'll shape that, but ultimately it's their decision because it's like they bear a lot of responsibility if that LLM goes wrong, right? We keep it flexible. But for us, typically when we're doing POCs and pilots, we use closed source models because they're best off-the-shelf models available to show basically proof of concept, right? On their data. And so we'll use an Anthropic or OpenAI or Azure OpenAI, again, depending on what the client is comfortable with. But then in production, once you have a lot of feedback that's being sent over, those all become instructions that you could do instruction tuning or fine tuning with. And so you could work with open source model, do fine tuning with it, and get to a really great outcome. At
Hmm.
that point, like the choice of open source, because there's so many open source models, most enterprises are not equipped to select that effectively.
Hmm.
So they do rely heavily on our guidance because we're doing a lot of R&D, we do a lot of research in that area. It's something that we know better than most enterprises at the very least. So we help go and guide and shape that conversation. I think that small language models are very I think they will become more effective. I think the challenge with small language models is that they have faster inference. They could run on edge devices, but they're just less powerful. They're less capable. And so we choose models that are 7 billion parameters, 13 billion parameters, sometimes 30 billion parameters, because they have a good trade-off between being effective and being cheap, but they're not going to be basically they're not limited like a 500 million parameter model would be. So I think there's certain trade-offs that have to be made, and we help a client, we make the trade-off for them most of the time, frankly, but we could help inform that decision if they want to be involved in that decision making.
Awesome. And not to sell what you do, but to just gush about it or clarify what an AI workforce is. Could you tap into the process of selecting the models for the AI workforce and how that could be more effective and productive in really creating an end-to-end automated process than just relying on one model or
Yeah.
one software?
Yeah, so great question. So I think the way we look at an AI workforce is we're trying to create AI knowledge workers at the end of the day. That's the long-term vision that we have. Right now, it's more akin to introducing calculators to your existing staff to go and become really effective and productive. There's a lot of value creation that can be done, but eventually, even some of the things that people are doing today you may no longer need people, and that means people kind of evolve and do different things. So then when you develop automation in those different tasks, it's not a one size fits all. It's not like one model is best at handling all the different tasks that are involved. Like querying a database might be a separate model trained on a separate set of data versus a model that is taking data out of documents to help the underwriting workflow. So we really focus on the best large language models trained on the appropriate data to accomplish different functions. And we have different flavors. Document AI does document processing tasks. Decision AI is making decisions on different types of data that come through from either documents or databases. That's the decisioning part of what we do. Then there's the querying part of our practice, which is the database AI and conversational AI. So it's getting the information out of databases and unstructured documents, all of which knowledge workers do, right? So right now we're doing facets of what a knowledge worker does. When you put these together, you have really incredible capabilities that give you the capabilities of a full-fledged knowledge worker. And that's the long-term vision. Right now, we're applying this in areas where it's ripe, which is document-heavy workflows, underwriting, prior auth in healthcare, claims processing and insurance. These are the areas where we're starting, and then plan is to expand that into a broader swath of knowledge work that people are doing mostly in middle office functions.
Time for me to put you on the spot. So I know you're talking about where you're starting and where you could go, but if you could do anything with anyone, what would it be? Within, when I say anything, I mean within the realm of generative AI and technology as you know it, with anyone, any type of company or process that you're like, ah, we have not done that, but oh, I want to do it and I want to do it with them.
Oh, that's a tough one.
Oh, I
Um,
know.
Yeah. So I think one big area that I've seen is business lending. And business lending is very thorny because commercial lending or business lending, unless you're a very, very large business, requires a ton of documents that you submit. And you submit that, and these could be bank statements, these could be revenue numbers, these could be basically a lot of financial data. Right now, there's a lot of brokers, a lot of people that go through the motion to get business loans out. It adds cost. It makes the whole market transparent. I mean, opaque, right? So it can be a lot more transparent, but it's opaque. It's very, very painful. And I think that being a business owner myself, having run startups, I think that's an area where I think you could have really great outcomes for businesses that are getting loans that they need in order to have an alternative to also venture capital.
Hmm.
And I think that's an area that I think is just underserved, under targeted, not solved. And I think doing that for major businesses that otherwise would be too large, like the cost of capital and the cost of people that are involved is too large for them to put forth. It would be really interesting to do for them. So like the JP Morgans, the Citigroups, the Bank of Americas that could get involved with small business loans, but frankly don't can't afford the personnel costs to do that. I think they could start opening up avenues using essentially AI agents to do that at scale.
Hmm. Wow. Well, you hear that, audience? We make this dream come true. Do you know anybody in the lending space that would be willing to be our lighthouse customer? All right, I'm going to talk about one last thing, right? Because we're talking about build, buy, partner, and we're usually, for at least for the enterprise, talking about that, in competition with or in addition to what's being done with, say, the Microsofts and Googles. How would you recommend some of these hyperscalers, these big companies, work with startups to help up their ante as well? Even given the fact that they are killing it, they're trailblazing. Like, how could they still work with the startup community? I know that Microsoft and Google, they all have accelerators and things like that, but like, what's your idea for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think eventually it's making GPUs available for startups to build on top of, right? I think there's a huge amount of
Mm.
GPU scarcity, and the GPUs are built for larger companies to use, like the clusters of GPUs. So I think making smaller clusters of GPUs available for more active work on POCs and pilots, I think that's an area that they could get involved with. I think we will start seeing more of the hyperscalers do work there, but fortunately, that void is being closed by what I would say is like specialty hardware companies. So basically GPU focused clouds, like these neo clouds that are coming up. That's been phenomenal to see. It's interesting, like a together.ai, right? That's cropping up. But it's creating, the lack of attention from these hyperscalers on working with startups a bit more. I think is creating this like the need and the rise of GPU focused clouds like a Together.ai, which is kind of really interesting.
Oh, how exciting. So usually problems with tech adoption, especially with generative AI, is a people problem, not necessarily a product problem. But in this case, this is definitely a product problem. It's the availability of these specific products for
Yeah,
these.
yeah, hard to reach scarcity. That's right.
Interesting, interesting. Well, I know, yeah, NVIDIA's accelerator gives away GPUs, and I think OpenAI was part of that accelerator. Writer is part of that accelerator. Helpful, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Well, I appreciate everyone's time here, and Suzanne, thanks for asking all these questions on behalf of the customer. Appreciate everyone's time. We will share a recording of this webinar and look forward to sharing details of the next webinar with you shortly. Thanks, everyone.
Appreciate you. Bye.
Yeah, bye.